Well, welcome all of you and your statistical colleagues who have put together the report, which must have taken an awful lot of work, particularly in the margins of everything that you've been doing in respect of COVID. Let me explain, as I do with all witnesses, the arrangements. You're talking not just to those in front of you, who are a mixture of statisticians and members of the public, and in particular participants, core participants, those to the left who are lawyers representing various different interests in the inquiry, those at the back who are members of or associated with the press. Beyond this room, however, there is a much larger audience still, partly in this building in a breakout room, but mainly on live stream and YouTube. It will probably number, if anything, yesterday is anything to go by, in the region of 300, there or thereabouts, people altogether listening to what you have to say. And obviously what you have to say will be transcribed for posterity. In a moment or two, Mary will invite you to take the oaths that you will each take, and then Ms. Richards will ask you the questions which arise from your report. If we do need anything by way of a chart, whiteboard, or anything like that, ask and we'll try to comply, but I can't promise that we will necessarily be able to. Mary.
Please state your full name.
Stephen James Weston Evans.
Take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Please state your full name.
Sheila MacDonald Bird.
And repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely.
I do solemnly, sincerely.
And truly declare and affirm.
And truly declare and affirm.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Please state your full name.
David John Spiegelhalter.
And repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely.
I do solemnly, sincerely.
And truly declare and affirm.
And truly declare and affirm.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
One other thing I must say before we begin, Ms. Richards. Professor Evans, I think you have a back condition which, if it troubles you, means that you may wish to get up and stand and move around. It won't be anything to do with your questions, Ms. Richards.
Well, it may be.
At least, that's what I'm assured.
So just before we start, can I mention one document that was disclosed to core participants last night? It's not directly related to the evidence we're going to hear, but as this is a day focused on numbers, I thought I would mention it. Sir, you'll recall that last month there was publicity on BBC News about the number of children who may have been infected with HIV as a result of treatment with blood products. And the figure given in the news reports was at least 175 children. You asked us, sir, to see whether we could try and explore the at least and to get a clearer sense of the numbers of children who might have been infected through blood products. And we produced a note. The reference for legal representatives is INQY 40387. I'm not going to go through it, but the upshot of the work that was undertaken, it was to suggest that the true figure in terms of the number of children infected, and this is children with bleeding disorders infected through blood products, not children who may have been infected through the transfusion route, it is likely to have been in the region of 380 rather than 175.
So more than double the headline figure to which some publicity was given.
Yes, and just to put it in context, that headline figure came from data relating to the HIV haemophilia litigation, and it reflected the number of children who were children at the time of the litigation still, and who were party to the litigation. So it was a subset of the bigger picture, which we've tried now to flesh out for you.
So there's a very good reason for the at least 175, but it may give a misleading picture if it is thought to be 175.
Precisely.
It is more than double that.
Precisely, sir.
And that's children at the time of infection.
Yes.
Thank you.
So if I can ask each of you, first of all, just to briefly outline for us the nature of your expertise and qualifications, starting with you, Professor Evans.
I'm originally a physicist who turned into a medical statistician. My current post, which I retired from at the end of September, is called pharmacoepidemiology. So my expertise is in applying analysis involving numbers to the safety of medicines and vaccines.
Professor Bird.
I'm a biostatistician, a medical statistician, and have worked on infectious diseases in the first part of the 1990s. I was the statistical director for an MRC biostatistical initiative in support of AIDS and HIV studies in Scotland, and subsequently have been concerned about the epidemic of injecting drug users in Scotland, both their infections through HIV, hepatitis C, and of course heroin-related deaths.
And Professor Spiegelhalter.
Yeah, I'm a biostatistician who, with a particular interest, I think, in analysing complex and imperfect data in relation to quite important issues. So I was involved in the Bristol inquiry into child heart deaths, into the Shipman inquiry for looking at his murders, and I've also been involved in media communication about COVID statistics.
And then there are a number of others who have assisted in the work that was undertaken for the purposes of producing the report and assisted in relation to the report itself. And their details are listed in the report. I'm not going to go through all the names. A number of them are present here. You three are giving evidence effectively representative of the wider group of experts who contributed to the report. Before we start with the detail of any of the report, Professor Evans, can I ask you to look at a passage near the beginning of the report and to make some observations about that? So, Lawrence, if we could have EXPG 5049, and if we could go to the introduction, which should be electronic page 10 and 11. And if we go to the next page, paragraph 0.6. Professor Evans, there's an observation there about numbers, statistics, and what may appear to be the harsh, cold terminology of numbers. And I think there was a point you wanted to make at the outset of the evidence.
Yes, I think that it's very easy for people to listen to the proceedings today and hear us talking about numbers. But as statisticians, we are very well aware of the human tragedy behind each one of these numbers. And when you hear us talking about numbers and rates and percentages and that sort of thing, it doesn't mean that we are ignoring the individuals who have had major trauma in their lives, and of course many of them have died, and there will be people who are continuing to be severely affected. And we acknowledge that, and we're not going to be able to keep on repeating that, but the numbers that we will talk about are a reflection from a statistical point of view of the tragedy, the damaged lives. We're going to be talking a great deal about death, but we also acknowledge that there are many other adverse consequences of the infected blood, many of which we have not addressed in our report.
Thank you, Professor. And then, as we'll explore in the course of the day, the conclusions that you have been able to reach are based on data, but the reliability or the degree of confidence that there may be in those conclusions will may depend upon the nature of the data that is available, the extent to which it is reliable, the extent to which it's complete. And if we go to the previous page, please, Lawrence. Paragraph 0.4. You've said this. Any conclusions we draw from data, this is picking it up in the second line, will depend on, and then you've set out, I think, 6 factors: availability, definitions, quality, completeness, and then the top of the next page is context and skill and interpretation. Could you just, again, by way of introduction, just perhaps explain those ideas to us?
I think that one of the things is that within the NHS in the UK, we do have, in principle, the ability to look at data that many other countries are unable to do. However, there are always tensions between making those data available and preserving the confidentiality of the people to whom they relate. And looking back over time, back to the 1970s, where we really begin rather than earlier times, there were very few places that were keeping data in any electronic format. And our ability today to be able to analyze data is heavily dependent on having data in an electronic format and also being able to link it. And a lot of the questions that we would like to ask would require electronic data from those periods linked, and it simply doesn't exist. Those sort of linkages. Now, the other thing is that in many instances, information is not collected and recorded. We don't have exact details in many instances of individual products, individual transfusions, where they came from. There is a great deal of data for which there is something, and my colleagues will talk a little bit more about that. Now, in terms of definitions, we have tried to be very precise in those, and it's very easy for people to use different definitions of things that will enable you to get different answers. And it's very easy for people to try and get the answer they want by altering the definition. We've tried to be clear because we aren't interested in getting an answer that we want. We are trying to find the truth, as we have affirmed and sworn. Now, again, in terms of quality, data may not be accurate. This particularly applies to things like death certificates. When you look for a cause of death on a death certificate, it may not be accurate for a number of reasons. One is that people don't always know the exact cause of death, even when there's been a post-mortem. But of course, in many instances, that won't have happened. So the data aren't accurate, not because somebody has been careless, but because there is ignorance. We do not know what the truth is for some of these things. And again, where people are collecting data for one purpose, it may not be suitable for the sort of analyses we would like to do. And there are a whole load of limitations of the data which are inevitable in some instances. We haven't made detailed comment on where we think things should have been done better. There will be incidental remarks on that, but there are a number of instances. But things have changed a great deal, so that during the COVID pandemic, we've been able to provide, through a collaboration I'm involved in, vaccine coverage for 95% of the population of England. But again, that shows that there are differences in data collection between England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. And although the UK is seen as a unit, very often things are done differently in the different places, and they may be done better in Scotland than in England, for example. But we have to live with what has happened in the past. And there have been improvements, undoubtedly. Doing it today, a lot of this would have been easier. But going back, very, very difficult.
And part of the consequence of those limitations is that your conclusions may have to be qualified. And there are two particular ways in which conclusions have been expressed in the report. And you've touched on this under the heading Communicating Uncertainty. If we go to page, it's probably page 4 electronically, Lawrence. Yes, thank you. So you've told us there that there are two ways in which uncertainty may be expressed. The use of numerical ranges in the form of confidence intervals and uncertainty intervals, and the use of confidence statements. Can I just ask you to explain those concepts to us, Professor Evans?
Yes, the first two, confidence intervals and uncertainty intervals, are things that we can calculate. They are based on the mathematics of things. And so we can know that if we do a survey of 50 people, the answers that we will get in terms of voting behaviour or anything, including the prevalence of HCV in those people, if we have 50 people, the uncertainty would be much greater than if we had 5,000 people. And so confidence intervals and uncertainty intervals are mathematical things that we can put probability statements on and say the probability is that the answer lies in this range, and we can do that with a pretty good sense that we've got that range of uncertainty measured given the assumptions we have. But the confidence statements are something different, because it may be that the source of data isn't a very good one, or the numbers that were given, the definitions weren't quite right, or that it was only done in a small area, not just having a wide confidence interval because it was small, but because that small area may not represent elsewhere. So the confidence statements are something that is subjective, and we can't really put numbers on that. So we put it on a scale from low to high, and that is a judgment. And on the whole, there is considerable agreement among statisticians that this particular study is a very reliable one, this one isn't. There's sometimes some disagreement, so this is inevitably subjective. But we hope that it will help people to say, we're reasonably certain in this area, but I'm afraid we're rather very uncertain in that area.
Now, in terms of the task which you've undertaken, the initial letter of instruction to the group, way back from September 2019, and we don't need to put it on screen, but I'll just read the reference into the transcript. It's INQY 40369. That asked the group to look at a very wide range of different issues, and would have involved looking at particular products and particular treatments and the like, and seeing what conclusions could be drawn. We'd asked you to consider whether you could answer questions about whether introduction of screening at different points in time might have resulted in fewer infections and deaths and so on. The COVID pandemic intervened, and many of you were very heavily involved in modelling and other work in relation to the pandemic. And as a result of that, as a direct result of that, we're not able to do the full range or look at the full range of questions that the inquiry had initially posed. And so I flagged that up so that those listening understand that the focus of the report that you were able to produce, notwithstanding your commitments in relation to COVID, is a narrower one. It still results in 180 pages of dense text and tables, but it's a narrower one, essentially looking as best you can at the numbers who were infected and numbers of deaths.
Yes, that's exactly so. I think I might argue that when we recruited the people to the panel, we recruited people who we thought were experts in the statistics of infectious diseases. And in September 2019, almost nobody knew about coronaviruses in the general world. And obviously everyone's very well aware. But it turns out that all of the people who were involved as statisticians have been working extraordinarily hard during the COVID pandemic, and I certainly was working 60 to 80 hours a week, which at an age of 79 is not necessarily a good idea. But my colleagues have been working even harder on this. But I think that the consequence was that we had to concentrate on getting numbers that were what were of interest to the inquiry. And we had relatively little time to be able to try and say what might have been done. That would have required a lot more discussion among us. It would have required a wide discussion, and it would require knowledge of things, and that's what we'd hoped to do. And there also, we haven't gone into details on individual products, as you say, and that might be of great importance. But I think, again, I would want to say to those who are core participants here, this is not because we regarded your individual circumstances as unimportant, but I think that you will probably agree that COVID in this country was also important, and we were under enormous pressure from a variety of situations. We were all independent academic statisticians, and we were being asked to do things, both in terms of the science and also advising government and trying to persuade them to do the right things in this pandemic. And it meant that we couldn't do things that we would have liked to have done. But it isn't because we regard those things as unimportant. And I think that we felt very strongly that it was better to answer a limited range of things with high quality analysis as far as we could, given the limitations, rather than trying to do a superficial job for the entire range on the letter of instruction. But we regret that we weren't able to do that. Had we had many longer, we could have produced probably 10 volumes or more, at least this size, to answer your letter of instruction.
Now, I'm going to just go through the executive summary, first of all, just so that we see the ultimate conclusions in terms of numbers that you were able to reach. And then what we'll do is turn to each of the separate chapters and go through those in turn. So if we could have that on screen, Lawrence, it's the next page, in fact.
Can I just take the time at this point to thank people? I've done relatively little of the work. My colleagues here are going to explain, and they've done rather more. And sitting in front of you are a number of people, and particularly Professor Crystal Donnelly, who, with two of her colleagues from Oxford, who are not members of the panel, they have done an extraordinary amount of work in under conditions of great stress, and have worked extraordinarily hard to be able to provide the numbers. And I would want to thank Ruth and Sarah and Crystal and Danny and Graham, who are here, and the other members, Nick Jewell and Penny Chan, for their contributions, but also the inquiry team themselves. Many of us have had interactions with them, and they have made our job as easy as it could be, even though it was very difficult. I won't go through the list of people at the moment, but I could do that at some point.
And in fact, you've identified them in the report as well.
Yes.
So if we just look at the figures in the executive summary, as I say, I'll come back and talk through each of the different sections in due course. So the first chapter looks at HIV infections in people with bleeding disorders and poses the question, how many people with bleeding disorders were infected with HIV through blood products in the period 1970 to 91 in the UK, and how many have died, and of those deaths, how many were due to HIV/AIDS? You've set out there the three data sources, which I will come back to, and then if we look at the conclusion beneath the table, you've said we conclude that around 1,250 people with bleeding disorders were infected with HIV in the UK between 1970 and 1991. Around 3/4 of these have died, around half have died of HIV-related causes. confidence that available evidence can answer the questions moderate slash high. So that's the first section of the report. If we go over the page, you then turn to consider HCV infections in people with bleeding disorders. And I think important to point out that the figures that you then give do not include the number given on the previous page, those infected with HIV. That effectively should be added if one's looking at it globally, because the assumption that you've worked on is that all those infected with HIV were also infected with hepatitis C. So the figures we have here are those who are solely infected with hepatitis C. And again, you've set out the data sources that you had. And then if we go down towards the bottom of the page, the last 2 bullet points, you say we judge that between 2,400 and 5,000 people with bleeding disorders were infected with HCV, excluding those infected with HIV. Confidence that available evidence can answer the questions low slash moderate. And again, we'll unpick all this in due course. The next page so the third category that you looked at, HIV infections in transfusion recipients, so those receiving blood components as opposed to blood products for the treatment of bleeding disorders. And the estimate there is at least 79 and possibly up to around 100 people were infected with HIV through blood transfusions in the UK. Around 85% have subsequently died, but we don't know the causes of death. And then the confidence statement there is moderate. And then if we go over the page, HCV infections in transfusion recipients. Now, this will, I think, be the most complex part of the evidence to understand for reasons that we'll come on to in due course. And this is the area that's required the most in terms of modelling, as I understand it. If we look towards, well, the bottom half of the page, we've got the table there. Number of people infected with HCV through blood transfusion between 1970 and 1991. The estimate 26,800, and then the 95% uncertainty interval, so which gives the numerical range, as I understand it, 21,300 to 38,800. So that's the figure in terms of or those are the figures in terms of infection with hepatitis C. The table then breaks it down, looking at numbers chronically infected, those who survived 10 years after transfusion, those surviving to the end of 2019, and then number of deaths. So again, we'll go through each of those stages in turn. But the figure for number of deaths by the end of 2019 related to HCV infection, the estimate 1,820, the 95% uncertainty interval is 650 to 3,320. And then we can see the confidence statement at the bottom of the page is moderate, and I'll be asking you to explain that in due course. And then if we go to the next page, Chapter 5 of your report refers to information from funds. That's from the trusts and schemes that were set up to provide financial support. I'm not going to be asking you about the detail of that section of your report, but we'll pick up the data that you had from the trusts and schemes in terms of the use you made of them as we go through the earlier chapters. And then Chapter 6 of your report looked at VCJD infections from blood and blood products. And the information there, out of 178 recorded cases of confirmed or probable VCJD in the UK, 5 were blood-borne infections. All 5 died, and then the confidence statement there is high. And then lastly, hepatitis B infections from blood and blood products. You were asked the same question as with the other infections, but are not able to answer it. And when we come to that part of your report, I'll invite you to explain why. So that's the executive summary, the overall figures that we're now going to work through chapter by chapter. And for my own sake, as much as anything, I'm going to ask you to bear in mind that we're not statisticians, and I'm going to be asking you to try and explain what are often quite complex ideas, particularly when we get to hepatitis C infections through transfusion, to explain those as simply and straightforwardly as you can for everyone's benefit. So if we start then with Chapter 1, And if we can have on screen, Lawrence, that it's internal page 8, so probably electronic 12. Professor Spiegelhalter, I'm going to ask you to talk us through this part of the report. First of all, in terms of some of the definitions, Professor Evans told us about the importance of those. Definitions in relation to bleeding disorders. You were looking there at those who had haemophilia, A, B or C, or von Willebrand disease.
Yes, those are put together under the heading people with bleeding disorders. I mean, it's sometimes shortened in the report to PWBD, but we'll talk about it in full.
And you had, as we see from that table, 3 sources of data. The first was the Macfarlane Trust. Those familiar with the inquiry are very familiar with the Macfarlane Trust and what it did, so I think, need to ask you anything more about what that was. The second source of data was UKHCDO. What was the nature of the data that you looked at from UKHCDO for this purpose?
This was provided by the UK Haemophilia Centre Doctors Organisation based on the NHD, the National Haemophilia Database, and this was provided to the inquiry specifically, according to the questions that were asked of them by the inquiry. And we based the data on the spreadsheets that they kindly provided and the information they provided in the report that's already, I think, been published by the inquiry.
Yes, and for the benefit of those listening, that report, and we don't need to put it on screen, is WITN 3826016. Just so that we can understand how that data was gathered, you've made some observations about it in paragraph 1.4, so the next page, please. And if we can just zoom in on paragraph 1.4. So you've explained there that data on the National Haemophilia Database not used for individual patient care, and you've said your impression is it's clearly been challenging for the National Haemophilia Database to establish an accurate, up-to-date database without duplicate records.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the voluntary submission of data by the centres, and one can read in the reports from the UKHCDO about the efforts that this is involved in terms of obtaining the data from the centres and also making sure that there are not duplicate records. And so, it's the same with with all voluntary databases, is that they depend on essentially the enthusiasm and the extra effort involved in centres submitting their data, and that always brings challenges in terms of collecting complete and reliable data.
And then the third data source was data held by the UK Health Security Agency. Now that's something which the inquiry has heard rather less about than UKHCDO and the Macfarlane Trust in its hearings. What's the nature of the HIV database held by the UKHSA?
Well, this is a database that's existed right from the beginning of the HIV epidemic, and it was run by successive renamed organisations, Public Health Laboratory Service and Health Protection Agency, and then Public Health England, and now UK Health Security Agency. But it's the same database that's been continually updated, and that has had access to data from both laboratories and from clinical information, and has attempted to keep as complete a record as possible of HIV cases in the country, along with the source of the infection and the type and whether it was acquired abroad or not. But as we'll see, that data is not always complete. I mean, I should say the interesting thing, to a statistician, it's very interesting to get 3 independent data sets. There hasn't, as far as we know, been any collaboration between these data sets at all, even though they will involve almost completely the same people. They've not been matched, and so these do provide, in a sense, independent sources of information about the quantities that we're interested in.
And in relation to the UKHSA's HIV database, that's a much wider database because it gathers information about, or tries to gather information about all cases of HIV, whatever the route of transmission. So in fact, the majority of cases on that database will be people infected not through blood or blood products. but people infected through drug use, sexual behaviour and so on.
Absolutely, and as we detail in the report, while there's always been a recording of whether the source was a blood product or the reporting of that data has been it has changed over time, and in fact has reduced in terms of the detail provided over time, so that recent reports just put everything together in other as a category.
And if we go to internal page 10, so page 14 electronically, if we just pick it up towards the bottom of the page.
Yeah, we can see that happening.
You explained there that in relation to the tables that have been supplied by the UK Health Security Agency, that in terms of the routes, there was a range of different codes used as to describe the source of the infection. And there was a point in time which was haemophilia, other blood products, and blood products undetermined. And that's introduces an element of uncertainty, essentially, into the analysis.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I've got to give real credit to the inquiry team and UKHSA for finding this data for us. This was not generally available in terms of this breakdown, and so we had to be specially provided with an updated spreadsheet that went back and checked this coding for previous cases. But there is, these labels are not exactly precise. There may be cases on, for example, von Willebrand's disease which are not included in haemophilia, so would not exactly match our definition of people with blood disorders that we're using. And there is always this category of blood products undetermined, in which they cannot confidently claim the route.
And we'll see this perhaps when we look at the numbers in relation to HIV infection through transfusion. But there isn't a code or for specifically for transfusion or blood components.
No, that's not. It was never recorded in that form.
And you've said, if we just go to the top of the next page. And sorry, I should have picked up the bottom of the previous page. We don't need to go back to it, but the UKHSA itself acknowledged problems in ensuring the accuracy of the database. And then you've observed there, second line at the top of the page, the records are also not necessarily complete, and patients' exposure routes are essentially self-reported. Can I just ask you to explain what that last point means?
Well, it means they were asked. There was an attempt had been made to elicit the source of the infection, but this will have varied in terms of the detail that could be provided from the clinician. Can I pass over to my colleague, Professor Bird,
Absolutely.
who will know more about this data collection on HIV cases, having worked in this area?
The route of infection is inquired about between patient and clinician. And some patients may choose not to reveal the route of infection even to their doctor. And so the information that the database ultimately holds is a matter of what has been able to be elicited. So, for instance, once we were concerned about hepatitis C a bit later on, the route of infection was very often unknown. But when you looked at those who had given a reported infection, you could see that 80% plus of the infections were through injection drug use. And so you can use statistical techniques to get around some of the problems. And one of the techniques that can be useful is cross-referencing between databases, which, as Professor Spiegelhalter explained, wasn't done for the HIV registers for patients with bleeding disorders, but can be a very useful technique and can allow you to estimate those who are missing from all three lists.
And then if we just go back to the first page of this chapter, so page 8, internal pagination, page 12 electronically, and we look at the figures that you've drawn from these sources, and I'm going to start by looking at the numbers of infections and then come on to the question of numbers of deaths. So the figure supplied by the Macfarlane Trust, 1,243, again, I think important to understand that is a figure that refers to those who were directly infected from their treatment. It does not include those indirectly infected, for example, as children or as spouses and partners.
It's only direct infections. In our whole report, we only deal with direct infections.
So that's the figure from the Macfarlane Trust, and all infected in the UK, because those are people whose entitlement had been accepted by the Macfarlane Trust. In relation to the UK HCDO database, the figure that they had was 1,338. They do not collect data separately as to the location of infection, and so is that why we understand that the middle column says unknown under the heading infected in the UK, but likely to be the great majority?
Yes, we don't have a record of the source of the site, place of infection. We do have a record of current residents.
And then if we look at the figures from UKHSA, the first figure we have for haemophiliac is 1,061. And is it right to understand that's the figure from the UKHSA's HIV database where the route of exposure has been coded as haemophiliac?
Yes.
And then the next figure you give us is haemophiliac plus undetermined. And can you just help us understand what that reference to undetermined is?
Well, if you remember, there were three categories that the UK HSA database uses: haemophiliac, other blood products, and blood products undetermined, which essentially is sort of missing data essentially as to what that route was. And so if all of those cases, I mean, we would, as we might get to, conclude that the majority of those was certainly likely to have been in from the haemophiliac, to use their phrase, category. If all of those got allocated to the haemophiliac, it would come to 1,243. But I should emphasise that the fact that there's two 1,243s in this figure is coincidence, because some of those in the UK HSA database will have been infected abroad, whereas the Macfarlane Trust should have been all infected in the UK.
Can you just then help us understand the basis upon which you reach the assessment that a significant proportion of the undetermined category would be people who were infected as a result of treatment for bleeding disorders?
Yeah, I mean, if we, could we find that table?
Yes.
I think that might help.
I think if we go to page, is it table 1.2?
I think it's table 1.2. No, that table 1.2 is UK HCDO. Sorry, I should have got this. I have the table 1.5. No, table 1.5.
So if we go to page 16, so electronic page 20. So if you could just talk us through this.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's a complex table, I'm afraid, but that's the information we received. If we look at, there's three columns there: haemophilia, other blood products, and blood products undetermined. There's a total of 1,484 cases in the database, with 1,061 haemophilia, 241 other blood products, which would include transfusion, and blood products undetermined 182. So, purely by the fact that at the moment haemophilia, dominates this category, we might expect just pro rata that most of those blood products undetermined were in fact haemophilia, but we genuinely don't know. And so if we allocate them later on, we say, well, if you allocate them proportionally according to proportion each year, we would come to around 1,185 haemophilia. But that is just a supposition, assuming proportional allocation. But the most we'd expect it to be would be 182, which would bring us to 1,243. So you can tell there's uncertainty in these numbers, which is why in the end, while the three sources come up with roughly similar figures, in the end we can only give a rough estimate of 1,250 as our overall conclusion.
And if we just go back to that summary table again on page 8, electronic page 12. We've got there the table that we've already looked at, and then the bullet point beneath it is we conclude around 1,250 people with bleeding disorders infected with HIV. Why have you taken the figure of around 1,250, and I appreciate it's around, rather than a higher figure, given the UK HCGO figure of 1,338?
I think because the UK HCDO figure includes an unknown number who were infected abroad. The Macfarlane Trust, we feel, is a reliable source that will contain, the actually overwhelming majority of cases. And the UK HCA data, although we think it comes in a slightly lower number than the Macfarlane Trust, we think that again provides reasonably consistent data, which is also why we come up with a moderate high assessment. We're not going to try to be precise about this or even give a quantified range, but we think that is the reasonable conclusion to draw on the basis of these three independent data sets.
And I think you say elsewhere in relation to the Macfarlane Trust, you recognise that there may be people who were missed, some who may have died before it was established.
It provides a minimum.
Yes, so it's the lower bound, essentially. It's going to be 1,243 plus. So it may be more than 1,250.
Absolutely, yes.
And then if we then come on to the second part of the question that you were asked to address in this chapter, which was numbers who had died, we can see in that same bullet point, which is highlighted, the second sentence says, around 3/4 of these have died and around half have died of HIV-related causes. Now, if I start with the first part of that, the around 3/4 of these have died, what's the basis for that assessment?
I think if we look at the third column of that table, we see quite a strong consistency again across data sets according to the actual numbers of deaths. Now, in this situation, I think the UK HSA database, which is linked to death registrations, and we feel it would be then have extremely reliable data on those proportions. We see a consistency of that, and that with the other sources, we would say around 3/4, that 75% is a reasonable judgment about that overall death rate. But we don't know from the UK HSA data we don't have causes of death recorded in that database.
And so,
for us.
And so, would it be right to understand that in terms of the assessment that around 3/4 have died, that is a moderate to high level of confidence?
I would put that as fairly high confidence, in fact, for that particular figure.
In part because of the consistency between, we see the Macfarlane Trust reporting 72% of deaths by 2013, and you've told us, I think there were a further 14 between 2017 and 2022 that you were aware of. You've got 76% from the UK HCDO and then 77% from the UK HSA. So it's that correlation from these three separate sources.
And the reliability of the death registration in this country.
But in terms of then saying how many had died of HIV-related causes, would it be right to understand that the confidence in relation to that may be different because that depends upon there being an accurate recording as part of the death certification process of something that's been picked up and identified as HIV-related? And
well, two reasons for having much lower confidence in that judgment is, first of all, we just don't know that data. There's no reports for that from the Macfarlane and the UK HSA database, just from the National Haemophilia database. And secondly, as you report, there's always concerns about causes of death, and particularly in relation to HIV coding, perhaps earlier on in the HIV epidemic. Now, I don't know if that's something that is a running issue, which we've already alluded to, and I don't know whether this is something to go into more detail now about why HIV coding might be less reliable even than other sources, or whether we want to do that later.
No, happy to pick that up now.
Yes, I'm not sure whether... Sheila, would you want to do that particular one?
Certainly, whenever we have a new disease, there can be uncertainty in identifying who has died from that disease. And so that will apply to HIV. It applied in the COVID epidemic, where our first death was at the end of January 2020. But that death was not recognized as a COVID death until the family asked for the post-mortem to be revised in August 2020, because the family recognized that the description that they were hearing about causes of death, COVID causes of death, chimed with what had happened to their father. And the same will happen with any new disease as doctors learn how that disease presents. So early on, there may have been deaths from HIV disease that, particularly before there was a test for HIV disease, that were not recognized as such. But that quickly is overcome as doctors learn, and they generally learn pretty quickly. And so that may have occurred pre-1985, 84, 85, before there was testing for HIV disease. And then there is a concern also sometimes that the family may have not wanted HIV to be reported on the death certificate. However, in general, doctors have a responsibility to the public health to do the best they can in reporting causes of death, because it is from those death registrations that we learn the full extent of the manifestations of any new disease. And so, although it is an issue, this is just a personal view, I would reckon that most doctors would prevail and want to report death as comprehensively as they can.
I should perhaps just observe that the inquiry has seen a number of individual accounts where that was not done, where there were deaths that were unquestionably related to directly HIV/AIDS, but the death certificate contained no clue to that.
I should add that in some cases, the evidence given to us suggests it's been a matter for interpretation, where the clinician has fudged the issue, but not by using the words HIV or AIDS, but by describing the opportunistic infection in terms which might convey to a clued-in reader that it was probably AIDS, but doesn't say so. So something like pneumocystis, pneumonia, for example, might suggest, or would suggest, that it was undoubtedly the result of an opportunistic infection as a consequence of HIV infection.
And so, if I may add, one of the important ways in which we learn about and which we learned about the manifestations of HIV disease was linkage between the register of people who had been HIV diagnosed against the death register to look at what were the causes of death that were appearing in the short term for people who died early versus died later from HIV disease. And that's one of the ways in which those sorts of pneumonia, so-called, would be picked up as potentially pneumocystis pneumonia.
I think also what I have to bear in mind is that the evidence suggests that doctors, though they had a responsibility to the public health, also considered themselves to have a responsibility to their patients,
Yes.
which on occasions meant that they did not wish to stigmatize, or potentially stigmatize, their patient by recording in a public document something which was kept private by the individual for very good social reasons.
Yes.
Yes, I should perhaps just add to that observation. The inquiry has obviously also heard about cases where it wasn't requested by the family, nor that AIDS or HIV should not be on the death certificate. And we have no insight into what led a doctor not to put that on the death certificate. I'm thinking of some of the evidence we heard in relation to Alderhase very recently.
Yes.
Where we simply don't know why that which was unquestionably an AIDS death is not so recorded. But in any event, would it be right to understand that in terms of saying how many of those deaths were from HIV-related causes, the data that you have is imperfect for the reasons we've just been exploring?
Yes, yeah. It's certainly not the same degree of confidence that we have in the overall death rate.
I'm going to then move to chapter 2 of the report, which looks at HCV infections in people with bleeding disorders. And we have that on page 19, or electronic page 23, please, Lawrence. So we've got the heading Summary Findings, where you've said this: in spite of the efforts made by the UK HCDO, it is challenging to establish the number of HCV infections in people with bleeding disorders due to the limited data on exposure and HCV status. And then you've set out there 3 data sources. One was UK HCDO. There's then, as I understand it, a subset of those, which is the National Haemophilia Database group, and then figures from the Skipton Fund. Professor Bird, can you perhaps assist us in understanding in broad terms the challenges in relation to the data on this issue?
Yes, the National Haemophilia Database holds information about patients that is less complete than the centres who treat those patients may know. And in particular, what is available through the UK Haemophilia Centre Directors Organisation report on HIV status is the information that has been reported to the database about HCV testing. And so it may be that patients in their local centres did in fact have an HCV test, and they know a diagnosis, but the centre does not. And so unlike with HIV disease, it may not have been the case that patients were immediately offered hepatitis C testing after 1991. And on the other hand, they may have been, but the database doesn't know it. And so we have not had access, obviously, to individual patient records. And so that's the uncertainty. The UK Haemophilia Centre Directors Organisation report, if we might look perhaps at table 2.1,
Yes,
which
so
is
if
on
we go,
page 22 on the report.
yes, so page 26 electronically.
Thank you. So the database, the first column refers to the patients who were HIV infected, and all are assumed to be also hepatitis C infected, though their hepatitis C infection might have occurred considerably earlier than their HIV infection. The next column tells us about those people whom the database knows to have tested hepatitis C antibody positive. The third column along is rather strange, because initially these people weren't known to have been hepatitis C antibody tested, but on the basis of their death certificate, the inference was made that they were in fact hepatitis C antibody tested. So you'll see that actually all of those people had died, and so it was information about their death that had allowed the deduction, even although they hadn't been told about HCV testing. And then the next column is those for whom the database is unaware about the HCV status, but there is information on the database that those persons had been exposed to at-risk pooled plasma products before 1988. And so there would be concern that those people might have contracted hepatitis C disease. And the next column along again, unknown to the database is the HCV status of these patients, but they were exposed to an at-risk blood component prior to 1992. And then the final column relates to people who had tested, whom the database knows were tested, HCV tested, and whose test result was negative. So that's where the uncertainty comes. There are two quite major columns that include about 2,000 400 people almost who could have been hepatitis C infected, but we don't actually know their status. And that's where the uncertainty comes, unfortunately.
And those categories that are shown in the table, you've described in the text of the report on the previous page. I won't go through them because you've helpfully explained them to us. But if we just look at the previous page, so page 21, we have there in paragraph 2.7 those categories, and there's no element of double counting. They're all mutually exclusive categories.
Well, that's a very good question. Because, of course, before you know the result, before the database knows the result of somebody's hepatitis C antibody test, they may well have been listed as somebody who was exposed to a pooled plasma product. And once the database knows that they've tested hepatitis C antibody positive, they're put into that column. And so they're not double counted, but they're shifted according to when information is acquired. Now, in order to do a thorough analysis of that, one needs to know when the information was acquired about, in other words, when somebody was hepatitis C tested, because essentially you have to live long enough to be tested. And so an important aspect is whether the database knows not only the fact of testing antibody positive, but when that test date was. And similarly, the fact of testing antibody negative, when that information was acquired. So you've asked a very astute question.
More by accident than design, I suspect. And then if we go to page 23, internal pagination, so 27 electronically, we've just got the heading limitations, and this is still in the context of your discussion of the UK HCDO data source in relation to hep C infections for those with bleeding disorders. You've identified their limitations. The patients will not include everyone who was exposed to infected blood products, despite the efforts made to determine their status. Some will have died before 1992, let alone before the 2010 look-back from causes not related to HCV. Others will not have been followed up by centres. And then reference to Professor Hayes' evidence in relation to the 2010 look-back. And there you've suggested that there's another uncertainty, essentially. There may be an undercount there as well. So that's the UK HCDO data. And then, as I said, the second source of data was National Haemophilia Database. In terms of giving us information about the overall numbers infected, does the National Haemophilia Database add much to the understanding that you've already got from UK HCDO?
Well, in this section, we are looking still at the National Haemophilia Database, but are restricting attention to those who were registered with the database before 1992 and who were first treated before 1992. Now that covers the majority of almost all of the HIV infected persons, and but about 70% of some of the other columns. But these are people for whom we've got fairly good information about gender, about their bleeding disorder and its severity, and whom we reckon have been subject to record linkage follow-up. There was a group where there were so few deaths that we were suspicious that they had been lost to follow-up in terms of the database. So this is a slightly more limited set for whom we think we have got more reasonable information about what happened in terms of mortality.
And then the third source of information was the Skipton Fund. So if we just go back, first of all, to page 19 of the report, electronic page 23. And again, I emphasise this is excluding those who were co-infected with HIV and hepatitis C. So the Skipton Fund figure there around 2,760. And to what extent does the Skipton Fund data add to what we've already looked at?
I would. It is another source of information, but what we don't know is gender, age. We don't have much descriptive, information about the patients to be able to understand the follow-up, how mortality evolved in these patients. We've got a total number who were registered, a total number who have died, and we don't know further. We don't have a database, a Skipton database, or the statistics expert group didn't have access to a Skipton database in the same way as, with the help of the inquiry, we were able to access some information from the National Haemophilia database.
And so if we just go a little further down the page so we can see the next bullet point, just going back then to those figures that we looked at previously when I was going through the executive summary, in terms of numbers infected with hepatitis C, people with bleeding disorders, excluding those infected with HIV, the range that you have given there is 2,400 to 5,000. The 2,400, effectively the source of that is those are the 2,400 confirmed UK HCDO cases.
Correct.
So that's the lower bound, that's the minimum.
Yes, that is a definite minimum.
And then the 5,000, again, does that essentially reflect those other two categories, those columns that we looked at in the UK HCDO database, which gave us at least 2,400 more?
Correct. And we've rounded up to 5,000 because of the confidence, which, as you see, is low to moderate here, and we don't want an over-precise figure.
And because there may be cases that are simply not captured by the UK HCDO database at all.
Yes.
So I'm going to move to the mortality data in relation to this section of the report, but perhaps we can do that after the break.
Yes, well, that would be a convenient time. Let's take a break now then until 12:15.
Thank you, sir.
12:15.